Disclaimer. To the Pharisees and Karens out there.
How dare you!
All guests on this show do not reflect the opinions of the host. The purpose of this show is to have interesting conversations, stretch our minds, and grow.
Not what we want!
If you are looking for an echo chamber, viewer and listener discretion
is advised.
You talk about extreme.
What is happening and what is up? Hold out your glass, because we're about to fill it up.
Torches high.
Look at it from a different perspective.
Hey guys, what is happening and what is up? Hold out that glass, baby, because you know what time it is. We about to fill it up. Welcome to the Prometheus Lens Podcast, a place where the conversations are always enlightening. I am your host, Doc Brown, and here we like to use the allegory of the Prometheus Lens to take a second look at everything. Well, hey, if you're new to the channel, welcome to the hero's journey. Be sure and hit that like button and smash that subscribe button. Be sure and check out this banner down below with all of our social medias at their various platforms. That would be much, much appreciated. Well, hey guys, I'm real excited. I'm always excited to have these conversations. I live for these conversations and the exchanging of puzzle pieces, as I like to say. But this is a man that I've read his stuff and watched him on television and cut my teeth on a lot of his work. So I took a swing at the ball and reached out to him, and he actually emailed me right back and was willing to come on and talk with us. And so I was really excited to get this man on the show. But I'd like to welcome to the show for the first time, hopefully first of many, Freddy Silva. Freddy, thank you for coming on and talking with us today.
Oh, sure, Justin. I think it was the accent that did it.
Yeah. It's a dead ringer every time.
It'll be a show of accents.
Yes, the clash of the accents. Well, for my listeners, maybe that's hasn't been exposed to your work and type of research, just kind of give everybody a feel of what you do, what your expertise is.
God, we could be here for an hour. Yeah, we'll cover my biography, and it's like, well, that's all the time we have for. I basically am apparently an expert. I used to be a pert at one point. Now I'm just an expert on ancient civilizations and ancient systems of knowledge. I've written 9 books and done about 15 documentaries, and they cover a wide gamut between megaliths, ancient cultures, connections with the gods, the origin of things, and also the information and the knowledge that they brought to us that basically began the foundation of human civilization. All of these things that happened in the deep past that has a great interest in my life to find out where we come from, because unless you know where you come from and how we attained the civilization that we have no idea where we're going. So that pretty much covers it in a nutshell.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I tell people a lot of times. It's like I feel like we're a species with amnesia, like Hancock says, but it's kind of like you walked in the middle of the movie and you're like, where are we at?
I know. It's like a bunch of people walking around with trauma, and it goes from generation to generation. There's some things we just don't want to sort of remember because they were just so traumatic. And I remember the phrase actually came from an American author in the 60s. And not many people know this, the species with amnesia. And I can't remember his name now, but he wrote, he's a precursor to Eric von Daniken. In fact, I suspect that Eric got a lot of information from this guy because I see a lot of parallels, but that's neither here or there. It was a guy who was interested just like me, but unlike us present researchers, he didn't have a lot of the information that we're privy to now. So his book is throwing darts at a board, but he's hitting all the right notes. He can't prove what he's saying, but now we can. So he talks about, where did the Inca come from? Where did that civilization come from? How do they inherit so much? Who built these pyramids that we could not replicate today? And he talks about the Great Flood and how we became a species with amnesia. And I'm still trying to remember his name. I'm trying to give him some credit, but It'll get there eventually. But it was a widely read book in the 60s in America and probably around the world. And it was one of these little Penguin classics, in small print. But it's full of wonderful passion and detail for the ancient past. And it really set the ball rolling. So I think a modicum of respect to this guy whose name I still can't come quite through. And I'm allowed. I was 60 now. I'm allowed to forget, a few names once in a while. But if it comes through, I'll let you know.
Oh, yeah. I got a couple of those Penguin books back there. I got like the Epic of Gilgamesh and a couple other of those, so I know what you're talking about there.
That was hard work.
Oh, yeah. But one thing, too, I love, I've listened to a lot of your discussions and things, how you love comparative mythology. And that's something that I really love, too. I love looking at all these different cultures and their stories and their legends and their lore and seeing what rhymes and what lines up, because often when we see so many common stories and just maybe the names have changed. And so to me, it's like if we have the same story throughout time, throughout culture, there has to be something to that. And one thing that I've noticed is like the Maya talk about we're in the fifth world. There's been 5, creations or great resets. And then you go to the Rig Vedas and they talk about we're in the 4th or 5th world. And you just see these, commonalities over and over again. And that's something that I hear you talk about a lot too.
Yeah, and it's fascinating because we were brought up in an education system, even in Britain and Europe and anywhere, that says that we started off as a bunch of cavemen that dragged their women by the hair into caves and were sitting there barbecuing on mammoths. And then we suddenly discovered civilization all around the world at the same time in about 8,000 BC. And we all discovered agriculture, animal husbandry, mathematics, astrology, and so forth. And I thought, well, wait a minute. If we weren't speaking to each other and we have no communication over each other across the world because we're so rudimentary, then how come we have the same stories? That doesn't make any sense. And it became the focus of, I think it was my 7th book, The Missing Lands, where I began to ask the same questions with more detail, because the more information we have now in the 21st century, the better the story becomes. And I began to actually ask the locals what they know about their traditions, not a bunch of white guys in Europe, being academics and not asking the right questions to the right people. I want to find out from the people whose ancestors were closer to the events that we're discussing, because they're bound to know more than we do. And sure enough, when I'm in South America, up in the high Andes with the Aymara, a bit like the Hopi, there's only about 8,000 of them left. So there is a dying civilization, and they have a genuine memory of when their deep ancestors arrived in Lake Titicaca. So you're at 13,000 feet of altitude, getting away from something very horrible. That's species with amnesia again, because they said, and I quote, "We came here during a massive conflagration at the end of the Ice Age, when there was water everywhere. There was tsunamis, what we call the Great Flood, and we came from a land over there in the middle of the Pacific called Kainga Nui Nui, or Lapaquiche, and some people called it Mu'ul, or Lemuria." And I thought, what? The Maya have exactly the same story. And I thought, well, do you know that the Maya have the same story? And they had, no, we have no idea. Who are the Maya? And I said, well, how did you get here? Well, because there was a god man called Viracocha, which is not really a name, it's a title. He basically brought 7 people with him who were masters of their craft. They were architects, people who knew how to do the terracing and how to grow crops at high altitude, and so forth. People who really understand the accoutrements of what it means to rebuild from scratch after everything's been destroyed. And I thought, well, wait a minute, I've heard this story also in Japan. And I've heard the same story with gods arriving out of nowhere with a bunch of qualified people and restarting civilization because everything was completely destroyed by enormous tidal waves. And that's where the penny dropped, that there was a root culture somewhere along the planet where these stories come from. Because I thought, if all things being equal, I don't think there was one single group of people. I think there was an academy of people that belonged to the same thought pattern, and they lived all around the world. And it turns out, yes, this concept of a continent in the middle of the Pacific wasn't alone. There was 8 other places where the gods used to live, by which I mean real people, not imaginary beings with wings. That's a Christian concept. It does not actually resemble reality. A God in their terms were people like you and I who just happen to understand the laws of nature and how to bend those laws to do what we call technology. And they lived on separate islands all around the world, 8 of them as far as I can figure out. And I've worked out where 6 of them were, so I've got 2 more to go. And they've all vanished, of course. They're underwater. And this pretty much sets up the whole concept that at the end of the Ice Age, there were survivors on both sides of the gods and humans, and the gods had to be going to the mainlands in order to help the survivors get back on their feet. And that's how we developed this concept of civilization among humans around 10,000 years ago. But that civilization came from pockets of people who already knew how things worked, how the universe works, and they taught it to us. And once we are back on our feet, they disappeared on their ships and they went AWOL back into the oceans, back to their disintegrating homelands. And some of them actually intermarried humans. It wasn't very successful at first. And you brought up the story of Gilgamesh. That story, when the Sumerians were writing about it, they inherited it from an earlier culture, because when they got the story, that story was already 5,000 years old. So Gilgamesh puts himself into the story, whether by design or by political machination, we don't know. But he could not have been the same person that was in the flood, because he would have been 5,000 years old by the time the story was written. So they're telling about a time and place where all of this destruction took place and all the accoutrements of civilization began to bear fruit around the world. And that made a lot of sense. There was a glue that kept the whole story together, and it came from different parts.
Yep, that's something too. And I'm a Christian, but I'm what a lot of Christians call the heretic Christian. But I try to tell people I'm Reggie the realist. You know, I think that everybody has pieces to the puzzle. And I don't think all the answers are in our one book. And I don't worship a book. You know, I think a lot of our people worship a book and thinks all the answers is in this one book. No, it's not. I'm sorry. It's an important book. I think there's a lot of wisdom to be pulled from that. But I think all these different religions and cultures throughout the world, they all have pieces. And I think it's pretty pompous. I've said it many times and I'll say it again. I think it's really pompous to think that the creator of the universe remained silent and only spoke to a very select group of people in the Levant.
And has set off all kinds of problems ever since. That's the irony of all this. I mean, so religion is supposed to be. It comes from a Latin word called religio, which means to bind together. And the one thing that religion does is set people apart, because we're more special than you. You know, I actually did some work looking at the origins of the Bible, and especially the Old Testament. It turns out much of it was actually plagiarized from the Babylonians, who had already borrowed the story from the Sumerians, and they put in some of their own particular, political machinations of their own, because they wanted to be superior to the Sumerians. So the pot calling the kettle black, it happens everywhere. And you look at the Torah and you look at all kinds of books around the world, they're all borrowing from everybody else. So the truth is everywhere. It's all spread over. So we need to learn to stop fighting about it and recognize that we're all borrowing from a source which we don't know where it came from. All we know, it was associated with groups of gods. And that's actually in the first line of the Old Testament about in the beginning there were gods, not God, gods, plural. And that is so true, because the ancient people like the Hopi, the Aymara, the Maya, they talk about the arrival of gods, plural, and that there was no superior hierarchy. They were just like us. They were just a little bit different. They knew about things that we didn't, because we were hunter-gatherers. And they said, there's no sense of hierarchy. It wasn't like we were worshipping anybody. Everybody got along just fine, because they knew that we're on this big ship called a planet, which goes through space, and we better learn to get along, because the alternative is not very pleasant. And by the way, heretic actually means the original meaning of heretic, someone in possession of the facts who can actually formulate the truth. That's what a heretic means. Wonderful word. And I tend not to confuse Christianity with Catholicism, because they're two very different things. And if you look at the actual facts behind this, esoteric Christianity was very, very different from what it has become under Catholicism. And I think that if Jesus was a lawyer today, he'd be very rich. He'd be suing everywhere left, right, and center. And he'd be saying, that's not what I meant. That's not what I said. And so few people would practice what he was doing. And what he was practicing was already very old hat by the time the Essenes were doing it, because the Essenes had borrowed from the Manichaeans, and they'd borrowed from the Mandeans, and they'd borrowed from the Hindus, and they'd borrowed from the people in Japan who had an original book called The Way of the Gods, which becomes The Way of the Essenes. And it was already established in 8,000 BC in Japan. And that understanding moves over the course of thousands of years to the Near East and around Jericho and Galilee and all those areas. So again, there's nothing new under the sun. And that's what I think that makes it much more interesting. And I believe if you just understand that as a fact, which can be verifiable, and I've written enough about this stuff, that we can stop fighting over it, all this stuff, all these minutiae with each other, so that we can get along and, make the earth a better place to live, rather than looking at Mars as a potential contender in which to grow vegetables and go and live in, because that will never work.
Yeah. And the thing is, too, is if people had the paradigm kind of like what I'm looking through, then they wouldn't have the divide lines and stuff, because I look at that, like you said, in creation, it says the Elohim. That I think that's plural, because it says us and our. In the beginning, let us create man in our image. I think that's a divine council, many gods. But the Deuteronomy 32 Tower of Babel, everybody just looks at the Genesis, it's just a tall building, and confuse the languages. But you go into Deuteronomy, it says that, he not only did he divide the languages, he divided the people amongst B'nai Ha-Elohim, the sons of God. Every time that phrase is used in Hebrew, that's talking about divine beings. So there's, the divine beings, like you were talking about, gods were portioned out, land. Yeah. So, I think that's why you see so many commonalities and portions and bits of the truth everywhere, because, I think it's hints of the truth throughout all of it. But
absolutely,
like anything else, they have free will. They can rebel too.
Well, absolutely, and they did. Some of them actually did. We don't know why. And the other problem, of course, is translation, because when the what we call the Bible is being translated, and it was going for Aramaic and Greek, by the time you get to Hebrew, there's huge errors involved. For example, in the later version, the Latin version, we talk about the Virgin Mary. Well, Virgo in the original Latin does not mean a virgin. It means a young woman of marriageable age. And the marriageable age back then, I think it was 16 or something. So it was a young woman who's ready to be married and take on children on board. Does not mean a virgin. And that changed the whole story of the virgin birth completely. The same thing with angels, angelos, which from Greek meant beings, communicators, go-betweens. Yeah, which we call the Watchers from the Book of Enoch, which is a wonderful book, by the way, if you happen to know the Ethiopian version. And it brings a lot of it into focus where, we go back to the gods who were living separately in separate places that behaved like islands around the planet. They did not want to hang out with humans at all, because they recognized that being a bit more advanced in the ways of things, to approach another culture that is still in development is to jeopardize and prejudice their future direction. And we know this because there have been scientists who go for a vacation in Papua New Guinea, and it happened about 30 years ago, and they inadvertently met a group of people in the middle of the jungle wearing absolutely nothing, a tribe we'd never even heard of. And that contact altered the direction of the tribe, not necessarily in a good way, because they had no hierarchy, they had no clothes, they had no status level, everybody was communal. And once they saw these gods coming out of the jungle with, things wrapped around their wrist that, with a dial that goes around, and they have little things that they put their ear and they communicate to each other, the scientists went back quietly a year later to find out if they had done any damage to the tribe. And they found that people started wearing clothes to differentiate the hierarchy from the lower people. There was some guy seated on a throne because he elevated himself above the rest of the crowd, and he had a banana leaf wrapped around his wrist because he was connected to the people that came from the beings that came from the jungle, and they were better than us. So you see, the logic to live quietly and away from the human race was very important. We don't know what there was a small group of people called Watchers who were the go-betweens between the gods and human beings who defied orders and ended up mating with women. And most of them died during childbirth because these people were 8.5 feet tall. And that is not going to fare very well for human women who gave birth to infants and they died. We have this story in Oklahoma with the Wichita of Oklahoma who have exactly the same story. They said that, there were some remnants of the gods that were here when we came over. And from the plains, and they asked if they could marry one of the women in the tribe. And they said, sure, if she agrees, yes, everybody's happy. But we will tell you now, it's going to be a very difficult childbirth because you guys are much taller than us, and it's not going to work out well.
Are you a hunter, a hiker, or just an outdoor enthusiast? Well, if you are, you know that good quality gear is hard to come by. And finding all-American made is like finding Bigfoot in the woods. Hence the name of Squatch Survival Gear. Head on over to squatchsurvivalgear.com. Use the code PLP10 for 10% off store-wide.
And they had to stop the practice because the women were just dying at childbirth. At some point, they succeeded. In Egypt, they did succeed after many trials and errors. And I think that concept worked its way into the Bible of, we will make humans in our image. There was that sort of slight mistranslation, but there was a genetic experiment between the gods and humans where they were doing something we just don't know. It's implied that there was obviously some splicing going on. And eventually they did come up with a bloodline that was half human and half divine, and that's what they called it. And in Egypt, it was called the Aku Shemsuhor, and that's the Shining Ones, the followers of Horus. So the Shining Ones was a nickname. It was to do with the fact that they had a problem. The skin was so light that they had a problem with their sunlight. They had to smear themselves with a kind of cream, a lotion. So when Enoch is there, and it's not his real name, by the way. His real name was Emed-Ur-Anu. He was one of the Anunnaki. He was a scribe, and he mentioned, they had to basically put some sunscreen on the skin, and they gave the skin a shining appearance. That's why we call them Shining Ones. But it's also because their demeanor as very intelligent people compared to humans gave them a certain demeanor, a certain glow. When you have a certain glow, you shine, and that's why we see pictures of the apostles, for example, or any holy people in the Buddhist tradition. There's a halo around them, isn't there? Jesus has a halo. The apostles have a halo. That's where it comes from. It shows that they are more enlightened than your average person. So, it's a very complicated story, but once you start stripping it apart and going back to the roots of the story, it begins to make a lot more sense. So, it takes away a lot of the stigma attached to what we come to call religion, and shows that we are much more sort of connected as humans than some people would like us to be.
Yeah, and also that Shining One, that's something that I discovered that really sent me down a rabbit trail, because when I discovered Mike Heiser's work, he's a biblical scholar, and he studied ancient dead languages and Sumerian, all this kind of stuff. He's one of those big brain guys, but he wrote The Unseen Realm, and he talked about the whole Deuteronomy 32 and the sons of God and all that kind of stuff, and the pantheon of gods in the Bible that just, sent everybody out lighting their torches and getting their pitchforks out of the barn. But he opened my eyes, man. But he was talking about the serpent in the garden. He said in Hebrew that's nakash, and he said it can mean serpent. He said, but it can also mean the Shining One. Or the
he's
one
right
that
on that
practices
account.
divination.
Yeah, he's right on that one. It refers to a title of office. The people who, and this happens all around the world, by the way, whether you're in India, whether you're in the Iberian Peninsula or the Maya, they have exactly the same title, the people of the serpent. And it has nothing to do with snakes or reptiles or anything. It's to do with the fact that when you understand the laws of nature at its very basic level, which is electricity and magnetism, that's what nature is all about, or electromagnetism. When you understand those currents that move through the earth and through us as beings as well, you become a master of the laws of nature. So you take on the title, a person of the serpent. So in India, the Anunnaki become the Anu Naga. And Naga is a serpent person. So, again, looking at the original translation of the Book of Enoch, he actually makes it very, very clear about what was happening. So there was Enki, one of the original gods, who loved humans, and he said, look, give them a chance. I know they're a bit rudimentary, but we've got to give them a chance to develop. I mean, it took us millions of years to get where we are, and we have spaceships and blah, blah, blah. Give him time. And, of course, his brother Enlil doesn't want anything to do with it. He was a real bastard. He just wanted the humans out of the way.
He was a hard ass.
He was hard ass. He was. I'm trying to find a common example in the modern era. I'm not finding it, but yeah, there's always that sort of that brotherly love of sibling rivalry that goes on, and that was a classic example. Now his wife Ninlil was the subject of the story of the Garden of Eden, because there she is in the garden doing all kinds of hybrid experiments with plants, and then she tells a group of the Watchers, "Well, look, go down the hill, go and talk to the humans who are having a real trouble trying to make bread, and show them that if you graft these two types together, you can create a wheat that you can basically crush the seeds and you can make bread with it." Tell them that and just bugger off back up the hill, and then they'll go, "Wow, who said that? Where were those strangers? Where did they come from?" Yeah, and they go back to doing what they're doing best. And there's a wonderful moment where Adama and Eva are in the Garden of Eden, somewhere in Armenia, apparently, as far as we can trace it. And they're trying to learn the fruits of the knowledge, or the tree of knowledge. And she says to them, "Well, look, don't worry about eating from the fruit of the tree," which is a metaphor, because once you understand that, you understand what we understand, and that's a very good thing. And basically, her title was a serpent lady. And it's right in the Book of Enoch. She is the serpent lady. Yeah, she is the wife of Enki, who's one of the people of the serpent. So that makes so much more sense. I mean, when you think about it, a talking serpent that speaks in Hebrew and Greek, I would be suspicious of a talking snake. I really would be. A lot of these stories come from metaphors.
And they're not taken back either, They're not like, "Holy crap, this thing's talking to me," or they didn't even second guess it. They trusted it. So
I know. It's like, yeah, it's talking to me. It makes so much more sense, and especially when you realize that ancient people wrote with metaphors and symbols a lot. And part of it was to, kind of long story short, but also to make sure that people who were uneducated would take these stories and run away with them and use the information to control other people. But the irony is that unless you understand the metaphor, and you've got to spend years learning this stuff. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years. I feel I'm still scratching the surface on this information, and I really am. So not so much of an expert as a student of the mysteries. Once you understand how they spoke and how they communicated, it becomes as easy to understand as the ABC. But you have to get there first to understand that everything's veiled in metaphor and symbol. You subtract the symbol, you look at things in different cultures when part of that culture can't tell you what it is, and you go somewhere else and they've got that symbol, they've got that understanding, and you apply it and you go, well, that fits in perfectly, that fits in the piece that's missing, and now the story really makes a lot more sense. A talking snake, absolutely, but it's not a reptile, it actually relates to a real person.
And you were talking about the bloodlines and stuff, and I was flipping through my notes because I was trying to find it, and I finally found it, but it was like way too late. But you were talking about the 8-foot tall people, the hybrid races. And I've heard you talk, I can't remember what podcast it was on. It might have been my buddy, because when I first found, well, not when I first found you, but when I first realized you would actually go on to smaller podcasts like mine, was my buddy Brad from the Awaken podcast. So shout out to Brad. But you had mentioned, I'm probably going to butcher the name, but Waitaharts.
Oh, the Waitaha, yes.
Yeah. So
they're still around.
Yeah, it says their gods are the Arukaru.
Oh, the Urukeu.
Yeah, but they
You're
were
doing very well.
red-haired, tall people.
Yes, and they were still alive. And I was I came back from New Zealand a couple of years ago. I've been there 6 times. I'm trying to emigrate there, actually. They don't make it easy, even for people from the Commonwealth. So we'll see how it goes. And I was promoting their story for many, many years. And unknowns to me, they were watching me all the time because I say the most wonderful things about them. And I have an affinity for these people. I don't know why. It's a personal story, which is developing, but I have an affinity for them. I know truth when I hear it. I really do. And they had an oral tradition, which was finally published in 1998, and someone gave me a copy of the 2 books, and it blew my mind. They were very down to earth. They were very nature-based people. They're not into warrior stuff. They are very friendly people, and they're also, a lot of them are blonde. And lighter skinned than most Polynesian people. And I thought, well, that's unusual. That got my attention. And they start talking about how they arrived there thousands of years ago, which is a very incendiary remark in New Zealand. And I had death threats from the Maori because they claim to be the indigenous people. And of course, they're not. There's evidence that shows that people lived in New Zealand and they were having a jolly good barbecue 6,000 years ago, not far from Hawke's Bay. So there goes that story out of the window. But that aside, the Waitaha were very clear that they were also not the first people there. They were originally in Easter Island when it was an archipelago. Now, unless you're an oceanographer, you won't know that because that situation existed during the Ice Age when the sea level was 400 feet lower. So that, to me, tells me they're telling me the truth. Why would they bother lying? And they said that every year they used to take on these wonderful people. They were called the gods, and they were very tall. They were light-skinned, and these are their words, by the way: light-skinned, blonde or red-haired, green-eyed or blue-eyed, and they're extremely tall people. And they also had longer facial features, and they also had beards, which in many parts of the Pacific, men genetically can't grow beards. So they stood out as a sore thumb. But they came from a big land in the east where they already had a big presence, which turns out to be Tiwanaku, up in Lake Titicaca, which is itself is 15,000 BC. So in order to get to where they were going, they had to stop on Easter Island and take on fresh water and some fish and some food and plants. And they would sit down with the tribal people and they said, look, we want to share what we know with you. And they would drip feed knowledge into the tribe. So the tribe would gather the information and they would apply it. And they would grow as a result because of the information that they were given. So it was a wonderful exchange. There was no sense of hierarchy at any moment. And then I wanted to find out where they were off to. Where were the gods going? Well, the gods were off to another place in the South Pacific called the birthplace of the gods. And I've been there 6 times. It's in the Alps. It's called Castle Hill in English. The locals know it as Kuratapiti, and it literally means the distant school of learning. It's a big astronomy on the side of a hill, and it's absolutely magic. And it's a very raw power, a real presence of place. And that was the academy where the Urukeu used to put and literally carve into the stone the knowledge of what they've acquired over God knows how many thousands of years. So if you go there now, and you should, and plan accordingly because there's nothing much around there, in the middle of the mountains. And the stones have been etched and you can still see the shapes of animals and people in the stone despite all the erosion. And sometimes nature does that naturally. But when I was first there, and I did know this story, to me it looked like I was looking at eroded faces of things and people. It's only after when I read the story and I heard the oral tradition, I said, oh no, we know who carved those. And from the pictures, you can still see the bits where the stone molds actually etched out the limestone. And if you go there when the light is low, you'll still see the shapes of where stone was used to carve out the actual images. So the Urukei was still going around for a long time. They survived the actual flood and the meteorites that hit the Pacific because they described their boats being capsized and the survivors being taken by a second boat to the birthplace of the gods. So, and once they'd done with that place, they went back to South America. So they were doing like a big triptych around the Pacific, and there was a lot more islands back then. And then the Waitaha married, or the Urukeu married into the Waitaha because not many of them survived the Great Flood. And so the lineage apparently apparently survived. Somehow they're able to interbreed quite successfully, and that's why they ended up with white-heart today. And they come to my lecture, and I can point them out. I say, "You're a white-heart." I said, "How'd you know?" "Because you're blonde. You shouldn't be blonde in Polynesia." And they go, "Yep, that's us. We intermarried with the gods, and the mother survived. We don't know how, but here we are." So they undertook the story that they inherited and the wisdom that they inherited from the Urukeu, and they said, when I was in a town called Te Wanaka, which is a variation of Te Wanaku. Okay, so you got Tiwanaku in Bolivia, and you've got Te Wanaka in South Island of New Zealand. I didn't see that coming at all. You can't make this up. And they said, no, and my great-great-grandparents remember seeing the Urukeu. They were still alive in the 1850s up on top of the mountain ranges down here, because a lot of that island is still quite undiscovered. There's only 1 million people, no, actually 500,000 people in the South Island of New Zealand. So, and I've walked quite a lot of it. A lot of those forests are impenetrable. The mountain ranges are no man's land. You just can't get there. So they were saying the Urukeu was still surviving in the 1850s. And of course, they couldn't interbreed with anybody anymore because they were about 8.5 feet tall. Yeah. And they just want to be left alone. A bit like the story of the Cherokee in America. When they came across the land, they went to West Virginia and the Appalachia area, and where you are in Tennessee. They put a lot of the mounds there, and they came across an old group of people called I think it's the Alawani. And yes, I think it is.
Allegheny.
The Allegheny. And they basically said the same thing, that these people survived the global catastrophe. They lived on an island in the middle of the Atlantic that sank during the global catastrophe, and they couldn't breed with humans. So they interbred. By the time we got around to seeing them, they lost hope. I mean, they knew they were going to die, and they became drunk, they would fight. So we inherited their culture to make sure they would never die. And we named a river in Pittsburgh after them, called the Allegheny. Isn't that amazing?
Yeah. And one thing, too, that popped in my head as you was talking about that, when I heard that on that other show you had done, before I'd heard that, I had listened to a lot of Robert Seffer, and he talks about the dragon court, or the serpent seed lineage, and he talks about, and he's an anthropologist, and he talks about all the common themes of green and blue eyes and red and blonde hair throughout the world, and how you can trace, this group of people and how they traveled and left their mark everywhere they went. But when I read about Viracocha and how they arrived, from the east on a boat without paddles, pale-skinned, beards, elongated skulls and all this stuff, and he had his group of Viracochan, and they taught all the sacred sciences, and then the path they took across South America, they called the Path of Viracocha, and like every single one of those cities named without fail. It's huge megalithic architecture. You find elongated skulls out the wazoo, and then they left, heading toward Easter Island and stuff out that way. But they said they would return when they needed them the most, and that's when Cortez and the guys show up, and they show up pale skinned with beards, and they thought that it was him returning, and that's why they just let him in. But some of the conquistadors and the explorers in their journals, they found a group of people that were pale skinned, elongated skulls, and red hair with beards. Yeah. And they, like you had said, it's everything contradictory to the indigenous people. They couldn't grow beards. They didn't have light skin. And so they were like, who are these people? Yeah. And it said, all the people said without fail, oh, these are the descendants of the Viracochan. And I always associated that with the Edfu building texts. I think it was Horus or Osiris. I can't remember which one, but one of them set sail and went east to civilize the world. I remember reading about that.
Yes, the Edfu building text.
I was like, could that have been Viracocha? But now you've spun me around, and I'm like, could it be these people that you're talking about.
Part of the same group of people. Yeah, because that was the reasoning that I came to, is that there couldn't have been the same people arriving in 8 different places around the planet at the same time, doing the same thing. It had to be a group of people, an academy that had the same genealogical and physiognomy, and that's what differentiated them from everybody else. That makes a lot more sense. And the more I've gone into ancient texts and talked to local people about it, the more it's becoming very obvious that, yes, they were a completely separate race, but they work together, and that makes sense because Horus, Jehuti, or Thoth, as the Greeks called them, they came from the island in the Indian Ocean called Iutiti, which is the place of ancestors, sometimes called the Island of Fire in the Edfu texts. And they were already looking up and down the Nile at the beginning of the Ice Age because they had to find somewhere to live because they could prognosticate the future, and they recognized that 900 years later, more comets would be destroying the Earth. I mean, they were great astrologers. They really, really were, and astronomers as well. And they could predict the path of comets and everything, which is why they were so obsessed with the sky. So they basically went to Egypt to start the founding mounds upon which, and I quote, the future temples will be built. So all the stuff that we see today in Egypt is basically a continuation of a trend that began 12,000 years ago.
With the price of eggs and bread slowly approaching a day's wages, it's more important than ever than to secure the value of your dollar. One thing that has remained steady is gold and silver throughout the ages. Back in Roman times, a piece of gold would get you a toga. That's the equivalent of $3,000 today. That still remains true to this day. For a full suit, shoes, tie, you're looking at about $3,000. Because gold and silver holds its value. So if you're tired of watching the value of your dollar go down every single day, it's time to get off your hands and make a move. I've recently teamed with Cornerstone Asset Metals. Reach out to those guys for all of your financial needs. It's time to trade in that forever devaluing dollar into hard assets that you can hold, like gold and silver. Be sure and check the link down in the description or the number on the screen. And hey, tell them Doc Brown sent you.
And again, they were very tall. And in fact, that's where I got the description of the height. It's actually in Karnak, in one of the walls of Karnak, 5 cubits, which if you use the basic royal cubit, that's about 8.5 feet tall. We've got those skeletons in the giants' graves in Brittany and in Britain and in Scotland and in Ireland. And they keep disappearing, of course. In Appalachia, it's the same thing with the Smithsonian coming over and finding the bones. They go to Washington, D.C., boom, they disappear. They're in Lompoc in California. They found the same thing. In fact, the Army Corps of Engineers in 1926 found the grave of an 8.5-foot tall Native American, they called it, and it turns out it was one of the last of the tribes that was around Mount Cuchama, which is on the border of Mexico today. So this is not a make-believe. These people really were much taller, and they would, the red hair didn't come because of the way you were buried in the ground. Because sometimes, if you and I, although your hair is much blacker than mine is today, if you bury yourself in the ground for a goodly amount of time when you're dead, the acid in the soil will give your hair a certain reddish color. But when you're doing this in the desert, and also in the Altiplano, South America, the soil and the sand will not do that. The red hair actually is real. It comes from a genetic makeup. So the point, and so it rammed the whole story home that we're dealing with the same academy of people, but different individuals and different groups of gods using the same information, going out from their different lands to basically restart civilization. So Horus comes from an island somewhere in the Indian Ocean, which I believe is somewhere off the coast of Saudi Arabia now. And Vitakosha came from Lapukije, which is also another place between Easter Islands and South America that's now gone, completely gone.
And I can't remember, I remember writing it down, though. It was an Egyptian that you had mentioned about having an elongated skull. And
Tutmosis III. Oh, sorry, not Tutmosis III. It was Amenhotep III.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah, if you go to the museum in Luxor, which is a lovely little museum. It's small, but it's packed with really good stuff in there. And if you happen to be a VIP, you can bribe your way. Well, it's called bakshish, you know. And I've been there 28 times, so they know me very well. I don't agree with a lot of what they say. They don't agree with my point of view, but I am respectful, and that gives me a way in. That's the way you do it. And I am respectful. We can agree to disagree. And they're being very, they have to toe the line, otherwise they get kicked out of of Egyptology by Zawi Hawass. That's the way the politics work down there. As Graham Hancock,
he's a gatekeeper.
Absolutely. And Boval and all those people, they've all been banned so many times because of what they say, which contradicts the story. But if you go down into the catacombs of Luxor Temple, of Luxor Museum, there is the actual mummified head of Amenhotep III, and you see copies of it in the markets everywhere, and you think, oh, they must have been making mold, just stretching it out for the tourists. No, he actually had a very, very extended head, and that's also the reason why they had those ridiculous hats on their head. They're not crowns; they're actually metaphors. It was to hide the fact that they were different from humans, and they wanted to be like ordinary people, so that they didn't fright the hell out of people like you and I. Because when you first see them, you go, "Oh, I'm not sure about that." Fear is a wonderful clouding of judgment. So the idea was to develop these ridiculous hats, which, by the way, no one's ever found. So obviously they didn't exist in reality.
I didn't know that. They've not found one?
No, they've never found one. The closest one that there was the head of Nefertiti, but that's a sculpture as well. It's not a real hat. The sculpture, I mean, the hat was trying to hide the fact that they were unusually cranially deformed. And there's something different about the way that if you have a child and you want to bind the head and make your child look like the gods, which is what they did in South America and in Bulgaria until the Middle Ages, they're still doing this, is when peasants who wanted their children to have a better chance at life bind the heads of the infants to make them look like the gods with a divine bloodline, so that they have a chance of marrying into the aristocracy. And they did. They would sell off their children to the aristocracy in Central Europe in order to have a better life. But the problem is, when you do that to young children, they look like cone heads. And I've seen the remains of those in Cusco, in the museum there. And you can tell the cone heads from the real elongated skulls. The elongated skulls, they look unusual, but there's something elegant about it. There's a certain natural proportion about it. But the other ones, you know that they've been bound to try and make them look like the gods, where they've failed miserably. So yes, Amenhotep III is the real thing. And of course, Akhenaten with his son. You can still see the deformation there. By that time, they're intermarrying so much to keep that bloodline going that the problems with miscegenization is that it starts to degrade the DNA on a human level, so you get problems physically. So by the time Tutankhamun comes along, he's got some serious physical issues, but he's also got the elongated skull, as did all the children. And you can see in all the reliefs in the museum in Luxor, where you have the children sitting on the lap of Akhenaten, and even a lot of the workers going about their daily lives that they took to the middle of the desert where they created the city of Amarna. They also have, a lot of them also, I noticed, they have a lot of elongated heads, and they're working there tilling the soil alongside average humans as well. That was quite a sight to see.
Yeah, and he was also known as the heretic king. You know, he's the one that demolished all the pantheon and went to the worship of the sun.
Yeah.
What do they call it? Ra? Was that it?
Amun.
Yes.
Aten.
Yes, the Aten. And also his wife, Nefertiti, I've seen that one picture with her from like a side profile, and you have that, going up, but it slopes back, just like you said, ever so elegantly. But she's holding this child, and it looks just like something straight off Sigourney Weaver's Alien. That elongated head is about as long as the body, and she's holding it up into the sunlight with the rays touching it. And
Yeah,
That
and
always stood
Nefertiti
out
wasn't
to
even
me.
Egyptian. I mean, she was actually Armenian, and that's not her real name, by the way. It's a title. In Armenian, it means she who is the backbone of the ruler. So it was literally a bond between two people that work together. The woman has the pharaoh's back, and vice versa, of course. There's a lot of interbreeding between the Armenian and the Egyptian families because that's what maintained the bloodline of the Anunnaki with the followers of Horus in Egypt. They're the same people. They just call them by different names. But the thing that the one thing that binds them together is the fact that they both were called Shining Ones as well. The Anunnaki were also called Shining Ones. So they kept that going. At least we can pick it up with the first pharaoh of a purely human bloodline, and that's an actual quote in the King's List, was Mena. Some people have actually stayed at his hotel opposite the pyramids, Mena House. And that's not his name either. Mena is an Armenian word that means the first ruler, and it's absolutely right. So when you sort of follow the tradition of the bloodline, they go all the way over to Amenhotep III, Hatshepsut, and Akhenaten. And of course, those two people were ripped out of the actual king list because they were different. They were trying to bring back the concept of the Atum, which is the central point of focus, not worship. It was about focus, because what happened was that the Atum priesthood, by his time, had taken over the entire concept of the temple, and it turned it into a quasi-religion, which we've started the conversation about religion setting people apart. Well, they figured out there was a great money-making way to get control. So by the time Amenhotep III comes along, he says, look, we've got 1 million gods now. There's a god for chairs, for God's sake, and a god for a glass, and a god for a toothpick. This is ridiculous. So he tried to actually begin the whole process of going back to the source, to figure out in order to understand all these myriads of gods, you have to understand where all this comes from. And we don't. We don't understand the source of this. Let's go back to the source. So that was politically unwise, and they basically pulled the power from under him. So by the time Akhenaten comes along, he says, I'm tired of all of this dragging around, this pussyfooting with the political system. I am just going to abolish the worship, not for the sake of abolishing, but to get people focused on one thing. And once we understand what that one thing is, we can understand how it breaks down into the myriad of gods, all of which represent natural laws. That's what they represent. It's to get you to understand the concept of mindfulness, the fact that, a plant has a god, a rock has a god. It's the spirit that's inherent in every living thing in the universe. It's
Shintoism. Like Shintoism and...
Absolutely. And it's about honoring life, and not destroying life, but honoring. If you honor things, they'll honor you and they'll protect you in return. Then we can go back and worshiping everything else. The destruction actually came mostly from the Amun priesthood. They tried to blame him for destroying and restricting the worship, when in fact he didn't do any of those things. That was a political move to get people riled up to say, oh, this guy has stopped you from worshiping all those gods. How do you feel about that? Oh, you can vote for us now. You see how it works. It's a political device, which is still going on today. It's called divide and conquer. You feed people propaganda, and if you're not aware of what's really going on, you buy the story, and it gives the people without power more power. So, of course, they take him out, and, of course, Tutankhamun, his son, they force him to change his name from Tutankhamun to Tutankhamun, and then they killed him anyway. It was a political coup because the head of the army takes over the rule of Egypt. He's not supposed to be ruling Egypt. He's not a pharaoh. He's the head of the army. Quite clearly, it was a political move and a total political coup. So I'm still pissed off about that after 3,500 years. I take that story very personally.
Oh, yeah. Who kills a little kid, man?
Leave the kid alone.
A sickly inbred kid at that. I mean, just leave the poor boy alone.
But you know what? His brother, Smenkare, was actually very important because he goes on to marry, let's see, that his marriage to the princess of Scythia bore a daughter, an Egyptian daughter, who then leaves the country because it's politically expedient to leave or get killed. So she goes back to what was then Scythia, which is the area around the Black Sea, around Ukraine and Romania, where the focus of the dragon bloodline is. And their daughter eventually moves to Ireland to become Scotta, which means the ruler of the people, from where we get the word Scotta land from. And those people were called the Tuatha De Danann, who were basically...
Oh, wow.
It's a corruption of Anunnaki. Tuatha De Danann in Scythia was Tuatha De Danu, and that was the original Anunnaki. So in 8,000 years or so, the bloodline from where the story comes from ends up in Ireland. And guess what? When they arrive in Ireland, they still found giants covered with red hair and still alive there. So they had to kick some serious giant ass to make sure that they weren't going to get eaten alive. Because when they found a giant in Ireland, they turned to barbarism. They literally ate people for fun.
Mm-hmm. And also, too, that stemmed from that was the Elven race. They were known as the Shining Ones.
That's right.
And you have all the myths and legends like you talk about. You got to understand the allegories. You know, that those saints weren't running serpents out of Ireland. They were running out these people that you were talking about.
Yeah, he cleared the island of serpent people, yeah. It was basically a political move by the Catholic Church to signal that, we got rid of the serpent bloodline, the tradition of the dragon and the serpent people. Of course, they didn't, because it's still in Wales. That's why there's a dragon on the flag of Wales to this very, very day. They're still there. It's all underground now, of course. But the whole idea was to signal to people that we got rid of everybody else and we're now in charge. But the funny thing is, they were the ones that came up with the word fairies. The Catholic Church actually came up with the word fairies. And back then, and this is of course funny, if it wasn't so tragic because so many people got killed over this, they had to get the Irish people away from honoring, not worshipping, honoring the Tuatha De Danann. Because they were still in the landscape. The bloodline was still functioning on some level because they got so much out of working with the divine bloodline because they grew as a spiritual people, the Celts and the Gaelic people. So they came up with the story of the fair folk is what they were called. They were fair because they were fair-skinned and they were blonde and red-haired. So the fair folk was their original nickname. Well, they turned it into fairies, but the fairies now became invisible, blood-sucking little suckers that if you were afflicted with fairies or you dreamt of fairies, that meant that the devil was after you. So you have to come to church and walk on your knees for 3 days, and then we'll baptize you. You're now part of the church, and you'll be protected from, blood-sucking fairies forever. So again, you can read into that the whole propaganda of getting the people of the land away from something that they honored and really enjoyed working with because it worked for them for thousands of years in order to get people to go to church. It was really that crude a technique. But they gave them lip service, and to this very day, a lot of people in Ireland, especially up in Donegal, still go to church and they go blah, 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 blah. But they still honor the fair folk and the fairy people in the mounds. And there are places on the land they know that the currents, the subtle energy of the land goes into their mounds, and they will never build a fence or a wall unless there's a hole in there to allow the fair folk and the energy of the fair folk to keep going into their old sacred sites. And they're very serious about this. Don't ever block those fairy paths because all kinds of problems will come down on you.
Well, that's a good segue because I definitely wanted to touch on sacred sites with you while I had your attention and time. And I know that's something that we don't have enough time to dive into fully. But just like quickly, you have recently, is it your most recent book?
Which one?
On portals and sacred sites?
Yes, it is.
Yeah, you care to just introduce that to the listeners?
Yeah, I actually wasn't going to write another book for quite a while. I'm not a person, as anybody knows me, that cash in on any kind of fad or anything. I write because I'm passionate about what I'm writing about. I don't care if there's a market for it. If there's something that I've written that will actually elevate the human condition, then I just publish it. But I was approached by an independent publisher who said, look, you're always talking about personal experiences at sacred sites and seeing the invisible world, which I do, actually. I didn't realize that you could do this by interacting with sacred space year after year after year. It develops your electrical current to a way where I can now see energy, I can see invisible people. It happens to anybody who works with this stuff, so it's not something special. We're born with this ability, we just get talked out of it. But I keep talking about snippets of things that have happened to me over the years, but they said, you've never written it down, and people are dying to hear about this. And I thought, really? People want to hear about my personal stories? Oh, God, there's a market for this. And I thought, okay, I could probably sit on a plane and write this. And, 5 chapters, I think, were written between Boston and London. I had my little cubicle in business class. I could just get there, and for 5 hours I can type a lot. And it just came out. And it was really about the understanding the subtlety of sacred space. And part of why sacred space differs from ordinary space is because the veil is very thin between the worlds. And now we have the technology to measure the fact that this is actually true. And if you look at, for example, in Brittany, where we have one of the greatest concentrations of megaliths on the planet, there have been skeptical electrical engineers that have gone there with their little probes up to the stones, and they've figured out, in a nutshell, that yes, every 78 minutes, these stones, these megaliths, they attract telluric currents and they store it. Depending on the shape of the monument, it'll behave like a battery, a coil, or an accumulator, and it disperses at a certain point in time. So if you happen to touch the stones at the wrong time at the wrong place, you'll get one hell of an electric shock. And he's absolutely right. And if you, under the right conditions at the right time, you will be in that current and you are able to perceive what's going on in the next level of reality. And I tell you, it's the most wonderful thing. So it made for a very short but very powerful little book of self-help to tell people how to interact with sacred space. Very different from anything I've done. More of a practical, a more pedestrian way of getting people involved in going to sacred sites for all the right reasons, not for selfies. You have to go there and become better than the sum of your parts. So the idea was to become a god in this lifetime. And the Maya did the same thing when they were, their predecessors, I should say, when they were building the foundation of Teotihuacan. And that's what it means, a place where a person goes to become a god, a bright star. That's what Teotihuacan actually means. And no one really understood this until you recognize that when you go to these sacred places, the energy of the site interacts with the electromagnetic current of your body. It moves the energy of your the magnetite in your brain, the iron that flows through your bloodstream, and that's what gets you to have heightened states of consciousness at these sites. And you do that long enough, it gives you confidence to accept that you can penetrate the next level of reality, and you become understanding of the laws of nature and how to bend the rules. Well, that's what a god is, someone who bends the rules of nature, nothing more. It's a bit like going to the Navajo and saying, how are we going to break this, the lack of rain? We have a drought for 5 years, and they'll go to the top of a sacred hill, not any hill, a sacred hill, and they'll pray for rain, and within an hour there's a massive deluge going through central New Mexico, and it washes away roads, buildings, cows, you name it. And that's what it means to work with this energy. And with sacred sites, you become cognizant of the laws of nature, and you can bend those rules a little bit. You can work and do things for our benefit. So that's what essentially the book was all about, trying to help people to understand that they don't have to be shy about big stones or sacred sites. Unusual things will happen at these places if you allow it.
Yeah, and that's something that's always really kind of fascinated me because, of course, you got these huge megalithic structures that in modernity we can't replicate, but you have all these experiences, people having all these experiences there and all these legends and stuff associated with it, and they always, 99% of the time align up to something astronomical. They're just amazing sites, and how many times has the Roman Catholic Church, took over a place and built a church on top of one of them because they know it's a powerful place. And same thing with the American government. All the Native Americans, all their portals and sacred sites, they've taken them and made them national forests, or taken them as government land and things like that. But I heard you mention about, I don't know how recent it was, but NASA had even verified some of your research and findings with something called X points?
The X points, yes.
And the crossing of serpents or something like that, you think is an allegory of the ancients referring to this?
Oh, it was wonderful. In fact, I was having a conversation with some NASA engineers at a UFO conference. They actually like to let their hair down, literally, by going to UFO conferences, because they're totally into this stuff. They just can't talk about it, because they don't want to feel that your taxpayers' dollars, my taxpayers' dollars, are going to look at woo-woo stuff. But they're totally into this, and you know who they are because they dress up like monks, but they have reptilian masks on top of them, and they're the funniest people. And we're having this chat before they actually published the press release, and it blew my mind when they used the word portals. They said, we actually, using our new technology that we have flying around the Earth, we can actually measure the energy coming out of the Earth. They're like these magnetic portals that open and close every so often. I think it's every 18 minutes or so. And they get to a point about 1,000 miles above the Earth's atmosphere, and they meet the solar wind, and they create these X points. Literally, that's what they look like in the actual image that they've captured. And those X points can then corral like big spirals, and these magnetic tubes literally go all the way to the sun and quite possibly way beyond into the rest of the solar system. And I said, it's funny, you should mention that in 2008, because back in about 8000 BC, and I'm talking about the Yajur Veda, which is a copy of an even earlier book that goes back another 6,000 years at the very least, if you follow the actual story in the book. They talk about something which we didn't know what they were talking about. We thought they were smoking something very strange. They talk about the serpents that flow along the earth that are mirrored in the heavens, which are the arrows of sorcerers. And the phrase stuck with me, and I thought, wait a minute. The serpent, in their language, is the telluric current. And that telluric current, we now know, goes from the ground to the sky. NASA just proved that. And the sorcerer is someone who works with source energy, basically a shaman or a magician, if you want to call it that. And the arrow of the sorcerer is the intention. You're taking the energy of electromagnetism from one place to the next. So now we know that you can direct this energy, not just along the earth, but also to the sky. And I said, what you've just discovered is what they were talking about 10,000 years ago. So now we know. We had to spend how many millions of dollars for the Hubble Space Telescope and all that equipment to find out what the people in southern India were observing quite naturally using their, God-given ability to perceive the subtle universe. Quite a wonderful moment.
Yeah, and I guess to put a bow on it and take us back full circle to the beginning, like you'd said at the beginning of this talk, to understand the end, you got to have a good grasp of the beginning. So we'll circle back to talking about lost civilizations and people with amnesia and all these great resets. That is why they studied the heavens so much, because these asteroids and all these events kept happening and causing these resets, and that's why the heavens were so important, and they were mapping in them and making these sacred sites and mapping them on earth as it is in heaven.
Absolutely. And it was very practical technology. We think about spacecraft and stuff like that, and computers. And no, I don't think that's what it was all about. I think they understood a natural science, and they could actually apply that. And it's very, very obvious in the old stories of Atlantis that the Egyptians were gathering. That's what it was all about. And it wasn't just the fact that they were figuring out how things move in the sky, because it was very important. I mean, luck favors the prepared. And we know from observation of archaeology and geology that we have gone through at least 13 near end of civilization scenarios since the end of the Ice Age. And it's always the same culprit. It's either solar activity, the sunspot cycle, or the plasma discharges, as Robert Schoch calls them. And there's also meteorites, and the meteorites are the big culprits, or the earth shakers, as they call them in South America and the Pacific. Those come around very regularly, and it usually happens in November and June as well. And the only meteor shower that we know that happens in November and comes back around in June is the Taurid meteor shower, which we just went through. 17 days of debris that the Earth has to go through. And it looks beautiful. You go out with a barbecue, at least where you are. Back here, it's a bit cold for a barbecue, but we look out and it's absolutely gorgeous. But among that debris field, are big chunks. And NASA, again, having this conversation with them, they said, yeah, we can now see with the Hubble Space Telescope the big chunks that were responsible for the Great Flood. That's why there was a flood. The rocks hit the oceans. That's how you generated tsunamis, which is why it's so hard to find the impact points, because they're gone. Alluvial soil, sand, erosion over time. Those big chunks are coming back again, and we know exactly the date when they're coming. And funny enough, I said that it's interesting because I've had that date for 25 years. It was actually mentioned in a crop circle, a real crop circle in England, not the man-made stuff. It gave us a date of the Earth missing and the solar system completely described, very accurate, 99% accuracy. And the Earth was missing, and we had a date in November in 2038, and that's exactly when the rocks are aiming to hit us again. And they're saying, we're a bit concerned. There's a 1 in 5 chance that they're going to hit this time. That's why every other week you have another press release talking about how can we get rid of near-Earth objects that are going to hit the Earth. Anything over a half a mile wide is mutual destruction, absolutely. So they're taking this very, very seriously. All this mumbo-jumbo that we're talking about, they take this very seriously because it completely validates why they're obsessed with the sky. Why did the Mayans had something like 14 calendars which track 140,000 years? I mean, why would you care if you're a farmer? You can plant trees and tell you where the sun and the moon are going to be, and when to plant and when to sow and when to reap. So you don't need to build temples that track this amount of time unless you want to know exactly where these things are. You can hide in caves for a month, come back and start again. Not like us cavemen, but prepared with seeds, with animals, and you can restart again. The Waitaha have this story. They were watching the sky. They knew what was happening. They hid in the caves of the South Island for about a month or two. They came back out. Everything was burnt to a crisp. The moa had been made extinct. All these birds and animals gone. Yeah, they said the whole of the east side of the South Island burnt to a crisp because of stuff that came out of the sky. And this time it was comets and plasma discharges from the sun, 2 for the price of 1. So again, you're prepared. You know what's going to happen. So this is why there was this obsession. But also, they understood the energetic connection between constellations and planets. And they placed, especially the menhirs, the big tall stones, they placed those in relationship to the star that they were trying to track, because they understood that there was an energetic connection between those points and the places on Earth. And wherever you see these big stones, and the stories around Brittany are very important to this very day, the farmers still talk about how when they grow crops near the big stones, the crops do better. There's a certain fertility about them that the crops that get further away don't have. And that's something that we've discovered in the last 20 years by measuring the energy of the stones. So they were pretty serious as to why they were dragging, 400-ton rocks from 60 miles away to plonk them here. It wasn't just because they were clever. It's because they were trying to give us something to think about.
Right. And that's why you see, like in Armenia, those huge underground cities and
Exactly.
and even the Edfu building text talks about, they remember times when the sun rised in the west and set in the east.
East. And one time the Earth was upside down, and it's incredible stuff. So in fact, we were talking about Atlantis at one point. I said, well, the funny thing is, it's you have to look at not the Greek story that Plato had, because Plato got the story from Solon, who was a visiting scholar in northern Egypt. It was Sais. It's somewhere around Sais. There was a temple there before Alexandria, and the Egyptian priest that was teaching the Greeks is a very funny story. He said, "You Greeks, you're way too young. Wait till you've been around as long as we have. We have seen the sun set where it now rises 4 times. The constellations have moved in the wrong place in the sky. And at one point, we experienced the Earth being upside down. And we don't mean the magnetic pole. The Earth got hit with something very big, and it actually went upside down. And sometimes the Earth actually stops because it gets hit with a centrifugal force that contravenes the movement and rotation of the Earth. And that story is actually in China, Japan, and India, and also in the Yucatan, opposite places of the world. In the Yucatan, they talk about the sun staying on the horizon for 3 days. And in India, they talk about the fact that they had night for 3 days. The sun never came up. So you can't make these stories up. They experienced literally the Earth standing still for 3 days. And then after 3 days, things begin to move yet again.
That's in the Bible too, Freddie.
And it's in the Bible too, exactly.
Joshua and Caleb.
Exactly. Oh, it's wonderful stuff. You just got to sit back and, not take it all too seriously and see the connections that exist all around the world.
Mm-hmm. Well, man, Freddie, thank you so much for your time. I tell people every week, time, that's life's most valuable asset, and I really appreciate you spending it with me and my listeners today.
Oh, my pleasure. Wherever you are.
And I really appreciate it, man. Hey, and hopefully this is the first of many because, like I said, I really enjoy your brain and how it works and all the different perspectives. For anybody that wasn't paying attention or was doing some laundry or something like that at the beginning of the show and missed the introduction, let them know where they can find you and your stuff, anything like you'd want to plug, books, websites, speaking engagements, anything like that.
Oh, I can cut it a long story short. If you go to my website, it's all there. All the books, there's audio books, there's physical books, which are much better than audio books because they got pictures. And then you won't complain about the fact that there's no pictures in an audio book. And believe me, I get that a lot. There are 15 documentaries, I think. The new documentary Megalith, which I'm very proud of. It's actually the only place where you'll see the original one, which is in black and white. And believe me, when you see the stones in black and white, they make a lot more sense than in color. So that's all there. It's at invisibletemple.com.
Awesome. Well, guys, be sure to check out his stuff, and I hope you enjoyed it. Hey, just remember, the difference between the known and the unknown is the journey. So, good journey, guys.